Hello and welcome to the Green Horizon podcast, where we delve into the intersection of climate policies and European politics. I'm Elisa, your expert on the European Parliament's climate initiatives and the future of the Green Deal.
Hi, and I'm Julia, here to break down the latest European election results. Let's get started.
So, first let us talk about the European Parliament. The EP has really stepped up its game in climate action over the past decade. Climate change is now a top priority thanks to the European Green Deal, which was launched in 2019. This ambitious plan aims for a carbon-neutral EU by 2050.
Yeah, that was really impressive. The Green Deal seems to be a significant milestone. How has the EP's role evolved to support such initiatives?
Good that you ask. Historically, the EP's powers in environmental policy expanded significantly, for instance with the Single European Act and the establishment of the Environmental Committee. The EP has become a crucial player in advocating for and shaping climate policies, contributing both to EU goals and global climate action.
Okay, with such initiatives, it sounds like the EP is positioning itself as a global leader in climate action. However, there are always challenges. What are the current and future hurdles they face?
Good that you mentioned the challenges. Of course, there are also challenges in this case. And while the EP has been an environmental champion, challenges do exist. These include balancing national interests with EU-wide goals and maintaining ambitious climate targets amid political fragmentation. And of course, dealing with external geopolitical shifts like the Ukraine conflict, which affects energy policies, of course. And on top of that, the EP has to deal with both internal and external pressure, rising from more Eurosceptics in the EP, for example, and the influence of international leaders such as former US President Trump, who challenged ambitious climate goals.
Okay, great. Thanks for the overview. Now let's talk more about the European Green Deal and the social implications of it. The European Green Deal is often compared to the US moon landing in terms of its significance, at least in media and also academic. How does it plan to integrate their environmental and social policies?
The Green Deal focuses on a just and inclusive transition, and it aims to ensure that all regions and communities benefit from the shift to a sustainable economy. And this includes initiatives such as the Just Transition Fund to support those most affected by the transition. And the framework also tries to balance protective social policies, which address inequalities, but on the other hand also productive policies, which foster economic growth and human capital development.
Okay, but balancing social equity with ambitious climate goals sounds pretty complex. What are the main debates around this balance?
You're right, and there is a significant tension between promoting green capitalism and ensuring environmental sustainability. And critics argue that the growth-driven model may not always align with sustainable practices. And additionally, the need for broader societal acceptance of these policies through inclusive measures is really crucial. And on top of that, especially since the war in the Ukraine has started, security considerations have risen on the agenda, and the importance of geopolitical autonomy was shown, especially with regards to fossil fuels. And however, the security considerations do not always go hand in hand with the environmental ones, and here the EP really has to find the balance.
Yeah, that sounds really challenging. Now, but we have this overview of the Green Deal. What is the role of the MEPs, so the members of European Parliament, and especially what are the voting dynamics in the EP?
The MEPs actually do play a crucial role in shaping and voting on EU legislation, including climate policies. And generally, there seems to be a consensus over the EU's responsibility for climate action. However, the MEPs clearly have different views on how to achieve this, and their voting behavior is influenced by several factors, including party affiliation, national interest, and ideological reasons. And party group influence seems to be one of the significant factors here, with the MEPs from liberal and green groups typically being strong supporters of ambitious climate legislation.
That sounds pretty challenging. What are the dynamics between the different political groups?
Well, now that you've mentioned it, the dynamics can be quite complex. And generally one can say that left-wing and Europhile fractions support ambitious climate targets more than the right-wing populist and Eurosceptic groups. However, there are still regional differences too, which influence the decisions. For instance, MEPs from Eastern Europe often have different priorities compared to their Western counterparts, sometimes leading to clashes over climate strategies.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense, I think. But let me just ask you, what about the MEP's personal beliefs and also their representation claims? How do they affect their voting?
So I think, the MEPs often balance various representation claims and so at the same time they're trying to represent the interests of their citizens, the member states, but sometimes also, for example, businesses who are involved. And this can lead to differing attitudes toward climate action. And another aspect is that some MEPs prioritize mitigation, which means that the reducing of the greenhouse gas emissions, while others focus more on adaptation strategies to rather manage the impacts of climate change.
Okay, thank you for that interesting insight. Let me just ask you one last question about that. How stable do you think is the support for ambitious climate policies within the European Parliament?
So interestingly, apart from all the challenges, MEPs did show surprisingly stable positions in their support for EU foreign climate policy ambitions from 2009 to 2019. And despite the rise of climate skeptic groups, overall the ambition remained high, partly also because of active debates and advocacy by more liberal and green parties. And still one has to mention that the EP's overall foreign climate policy ambition did not meet the Paris Agreement goals. And on top of that, recent elections have increased the vocalness of climate skeptic groups, adding new challenges. For instance, if we take a look at the far right in the European Parliament, one can see that they mostly changed their strategy from outright denying climate change to now showing skepticism towards the scientific processes and policy responses. And frequent arguments brought forward by the far right deal with concerns of national sovereignty and economic well-being, so they are pushing rather low ambition climate measures in order to remain globally competitive. However, also in the face of recent and future elections, a further analysis of the far-right parties' diverse positions and their communication on climate change would be needed in order to develop counter-strategies.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that really interesting overview. This is super interesting, especially when you also look at the election results of this year's EP election.
Speaking of the elections, the recent European election results have shown quite a shift. Can you give us an overview of what happened in June 2024?
Of course. Well, as you already mentioned, the 2024 European elections saw a trend with a shift towards the right. First, maybe for the general numbers, overall voter turnout was at 51%, which is not a bad rate compared to, for example, 2014, where it was only at 42.9%. Now looking closer at the EP parties, the Conservative European People's Party, short EPP, remains the largest party, gaining a slight increase to 26.3% of the votes. But right-wing parties like the European Conservatives and Reformists, short ECR, also gained votes, bringing them to 10.8%. And the Patriots for Europe, or former Identity and Democracy, they went up to 11.6. Especially this group is a bit concerning because they follow very right-wing anti-immigration and EU critical politics, and they have gained a strong following compared to the last EP elections in 2019. In the last, now outgoing parliament, they occupied 9 seats, and now in this election they were able to win 84 seats, which is quite a significant gain, especially considering their position on the far right in the European Parliament. So yes, we can see a shift to the right now, that about half of the parliament is occupied by conservative, right-wing and also radical right-wing MEPs.
That does sound like a really significant shift. Do you have any ideas about what effect this had on the other major parties?
Well, sure. Maybe let's look at the numbers for the other parties. The Socialists and Democrats, so S&D short, had a small decline, dropping from 20% to 18.9%, which is of course not great for them at all, but they were definitely not the significant losers in this election. The biggest losses of voters were seen by the Liberal Renew group, which shrank from 14.2 to 10.3%, now only occupying 77 instead of 98 seats. And of course the Greens, the focus of today's episode, who dropped from 10.11 to only 7.3%. This reduction in the Green representation is quite significant. They lost 17 seats, now only holding 53 of the 720 seats in the parliament. The loss was especially visible in Germany, France, Belgium and Italy.
Oh wow, that's quite a substantial loss for the Greens. Can you explain what the key factors behind this shift were?
Sure. Well, it's important first of all to understand what happened since the elections in 2019. And at that time, a lot of crises happened, such as the corona crisis, the war in the Ukraine, and an economic crisis. These issues and resulting concerns of the voters overshadowed the election. The topics that the European voters, for example, were most concerned about in the election were peace and security, energy independence, and questions of food security. And these topics played into the hands of the far right, who capitalized on voters' concerns about security and economic stability using populism in many cases. So they supplied voters with easy solutions to the complex and also often overwhelming current state of Europe and the world. Compared to that, the climate crisis, which was a major focus in 2019, took a backseat. Moreover, the Green Deal was not a central issue in many campaigns. Instead, the importance of technology development was put into focus when talking about the climate crisis. This further diluted the impact of pro-climate messaging, and it took away from the perceived significance. So, topics that the Greens were able to profit from before and show their competencies as a political party in the EU were no longer seen as crucial enough to vote for them.
Okay, thank you. Now that we've discussed some insights from the European elections, let's try to get a deeper understanding for why the Green parties lost so many votes in particular countries. And for that, we decided to focus on one example, and now we'll dive deeper into the specifics for Germany. Julia, how did the elections unfold there?
Well, yes, Germany is a really good example, I think, as the trend of the elections there really mirrored the overall EU results. So let's again look at the numbers first. Voter turnout was quite high there, was at 64.8%, which is actually the highest there since the elections in 1979, which is of course a very welcome development, considering that European elections are often not seen as the election of first priority. And now looking at the numbers of the parties in Germany, we can see again that the conservatives and right-wing parties gained votes, while the Greens and liberal parties like the FDP lost ground. The conservative CDU or CSU alliance performed very well, as did the far-right AfD. So we can see that the overall trend represented in Germany, also represented in the EU, is also seen in Germany. Although I do think it's really important to shortly mention that the AfD actually got kicked out of their party in the EP. They were part of the Patriots in Europe, and they were kicked out shortly before the election. But this is a big of a topic to dive into in this episode as well. It is also very important to mention, I think, that in Germany the smaller, less established parties performed very well. They gained 12 of the 96 seats in Germany, and they gained 12 from the 96 seats that German parties occupy in the parliament. Notably, also the newly formed populist left conservative party, Bündnis Wagenknecht, as they gained 6.2%.
Well, it also seemed like the Greens' performance in Germany was particularly disappointing, wasn't it? Especially compared to the 2019 elections.
Oh yes, it was. The 2019 elections were great for the Greens. They got 20% of the votes, but this year they fell to only 12% of the votes. Not only did they lose among the whole population, but they lost significantly with the young voters, the age 16 to 24, where they only got 11% of the votes. This is especially surprising since they were the largest party in this age group in 2019.
Oh, that's quite interesting. What do you think? Why did the Greens lose so much support, especially among the young voters?
Well, there are several factors that contributed. Maybe first, let's look at the Greens' campaign for this election. In their official campaign release, they claim to focus strongly on the issue of safety and peace, social security, prosperity, and climate change. However, when looking at what the voters saw as their main competency, they did not gain in any of the concerned topics, such as national safety or economic security, but they did lose significantly in the topic of climate politics, where only 33% of the voters saw it as their main competency. This is concerning, as it leaves the question what space the party occupies if the voters do not see them as a main competency in any of the significant issues. The voting campaign was especially criticized for lacking any specific claims for their main topics, such as security and peace. Even the Green politician Göring Eckardt herself said they would have had to emphasize the social aspect of climate politics more, not just in this election campaign, but also in their government work in Germany before the election. Furthermore, there was also criticism from climate movements themselves about the lack of constructive climate politics within the German government, but also that the claims of the Greens for the climate politics in the EU are not really anything new or significant. They mostly were sticking with the existing climate goals for the EU. This also partly explains why they lost among young voters. Of course, many shifted more to the right, voting for CDU or AfD, as both parties gained quite a lot of votes from the young generation. But it also is important to note that the small parties that are usually under the 5% hurdle in Germany, got 28% of the votes of young people. So there's also a movement away from the Greens to more radical climate parties, such as the Animal Party. In general, the Greens' place in the political landscape is not fully defined right now, I think. Some things that's already discussed in the academic field. So in short, they used to be quite a radical climate party in the beginning, but they moved towards a more mainstream and compromise-oriented politics. But they occupy now space that's not radical enough for the voters that are truly concerned with the climate crisis, and they're not associated enough with topics with other topics to attract more conservative voters. So to conclude, a lot of different factors played into the disappointing results of the Greens in this election in Germany. So yes, very complex dynamics here, but I hope I gave an overview that helped to clear it up a little bit.
Yeah, it really helped to clear it up. It was really complex, but thank you very much for this insightful analysis of the recent happenings in Germany.
Yeah, so now that we have this overview about the election results, what does the future hold for the EP Greens and the European climate politics?
Obviously the rise of right-wing and nationalist parties will make it challenging to pass new climate legislation. However, existing policies like the Green Deal are expected to remain, even though there might be less ambitious implementation to it. And the key will probably be the framing of future projects, especially in terms of industrial competitiveness and security alongside the sustainability aspects.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. It seems like a critical moment for the European Parliament. How do you think this will all affect the Franco-German cooperation on climate issues?
Well, we could see significant political shifts in France and Germany, which will undoubtedly influence EU dynamics since these are the two biggest member states. And with the EP's composition changing, it remains to be seen how stable and reliable majorities will be in the end. And even though there is still a democratic and pro-European majority, this uncertainty could really impact cooperation and the EP's role as a counterweight to more nationalist members.
All right. Now that we have all the information and kind of have a good overview, I would say, about the election results as well as the topic of climate policies in the EP, we're coming to the part of the podcast where we're discussing a bit more, kind of also talking about future of the EP and what we think of the whole topic. What are your thoughts, Elisa? Is there anything you want to add that we didn't talk about yet?
Yeah, I mean, I did mention the aspect of global cooperation, but I think especially with the upcoming elections in the US, this might be a crucial moment for the global cooperation on climate policies, especially if Trump really wins the elections. It's becoming a major factor in the global cooperation, and it might be a bit critical to work together with Trump on ambitious climate goals, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important aspect you're mentioning here. I think it's something we've been seeing across the whole global scale. I mean, considering also that the EP elections didn't really show a pro-climate picture in the EU. It seems like a bit scary almost that maybe Trump might also win in the US now, and we don't really have a leading champion for climate policies right now, I feel like, in the whole world. I mean, China of course is doing stuff, but also they're not a democracy, so it's also like working with them together is not something that seems high on the list of the EEP or the EU in general, nor the US of course. So at least kind of the question, where are we going to go globally with climate politics?
Yeah, and as well, if we look at the composition of the EP, so in the past, the conservative parties have kind of made compromises and adapted to the position of the more liberal and green parties, but now that so many right-wing and populist members are in the EP, I think it gets interesting what the conservatives or the parties in the center will do, and if they will adapt more to the right-wing parties.
Yeah, I mean, that's truly a scary prospect to look forward to, considering especially that migration is very on top of the list of the right-wing parties, not necessarily the climate, more the opposite actually. The climate seems very low on the list, and people are not very willing to pay or even pay attention to the climate right now, it feels like. So kind of leaves open the question, is it fully in the power of the conservatives, or can maybe also the social, green and left parties also move together and maybe kind of put pressure on the European Parliament to maybe be a bit more focused on climate policies as well? But I do think that's something that we'll have to see, especially considering that now also the Commission President is probably going to be Ursula von der Leyen again. Kind of also leaves open the question if what her move is going to be, and if there's going to be pressure from some sides of the EP at least, or if they're also going to go with different focuses this election period.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think also regarding the current situation with wars and conflicts happening, and probably that they will not die down in the future, and migration and security considerations will be a critical point on the agenda, and I think it will be maybe a crucial factor also for the Green parties if they can actually make clear that they also have this on their agenda, and to show people that they are also concerned with security, but that security considerations and climate policies can be balanced out maybe, so that it's not just the one or the other topic.
Yes, and I do think also here it's very important to really emphasize the social aspect between climate justice, as also German green politicians also said themselves. It's an important issue. They kind of fail to put into focus. So people are concerned with their social security. They are concerned that they might lose their well-being, their economic well-being especially, and it is also part of climate action to also secure the social and economic well-being of the people. And also something I do think that's kind of significant is that one of the biggest concerns of the voters this election was that energy is a big topic, and energy security especially, because we saw the war in Russia that all of a sudden we had big concerns about energy and where do we get our energy from and how are we supplied with energy. And it would have been a great topic to delve into for the Greens, to use that and say we need renewable energy and we really need to get behind that as the EU to be independent from other bigger countries to supply us with energy. But I did not really see that they did that in a way that really benefited them. I do think they did that while it was a big topic, when the war started, when these concerns came up, but they did not really use that for their election campaigns, as far as I saw. So I do think that's something where they really missed out, because it connects the issue of security with the issue of the climate change.
Yeah, that's true. I think like what we've seen with the crisis in the Ukraine and the fossil fuel crisis, that a lot of people really felt left behind, and they couldn't really pay their bills anymore. And then if there are like proposals about like green energy, but if there's not enough funding and people have to pay for like heating changes themselves, then it's clear that people are not gonna be ambitious to pay more.
Yes.
If they already feel like they can't even like afford to go grocery shopping anymore.
Yes, exactly, or take a hot shower every now and then. Yes, I do think so too. And something also that we already touched upon a bit, but I do think it's a really crucial issue in this election, is that populism becomes bigger and bigger on different sides. I mean, I mentioned in Germany we have the party Bündnis Wagenknecht, who's on the one hand very left, using social topics to show their left-sided politics, but they also are very conservative when it comes to migration, also the climate in parts. So we really do see that the parties that try to gain votes with populism do not focus on the climate, but they do focus on these issues that scare people. And the Greens did not really do that, which of course I would say it's always good to not use populism, of course, but they did not get a lot of attention. They always seem to complicate it, and I think that happened in a lot of countries, but especially Germany, having that example in mind right now. We did see that everything seemed complicated, especially with them and the government. They kind of got pushed over a lot by the other parties in their coalition, and they also were just not clear enough on a lot of issues in their campaign, I think.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean also, like with the recent elections in France, I think that showed that a lot of people do not really feel represented by one specific party, even though they clearly don't want a like radical right government. Like one could see that in the end they voted for the left. But it seems like there's not a party which really represents all their concerns.
And I do think that's also understandable to a certain extent, because we have so many things going on right now in the world, and it seems truly overwhelming. And I think if you don't have a deeper understanding for politics, which of course not everyone can have, not everyone has the ability to study politics, you might not understand everything, and that's totally understandable. But then it kind of leaves people behind if you make everything seem more complicated than it might be, or don't find ways to explain it to people when it's complicated. So I think that's kind of what's missing right now, and that's something that, of course, populists are able to profit on. Yeah. So I think we have this hole right now in the middle, and also in just serious political parties that want to change something genuinely from deep within. They kind of miss out on reaching the extra voters.
Yeah, and I think like what we've also seen with the far right, for example, the AfD in Germany, that they reached a lot of young voters through like TikTok, for example, and I think like the other parties really missed something there, because also looking at statistics for the European elections, one could see that around 50% of the younger voters either did not know that the election was happening or did not know the correct date for the election. So in the end, I think, it might be also crucial how to reach out to people and how to get the message across.
Yeah, I think that's really concerning that young people are kind of slipping away already. And I mean, social media is something that's definitely part of that. I did also see for Germany some data where it was also kind of mentioned that for the Greens it was also mostly the topic that people didn't really like saw themselves identify themselves with, which I think is really interesting. As I said, in 2019 it was the opposite. Young people voted for the Greens mostly as the main party. I mean, not mostly, but as the majority party. And that is really interesting how much of a shift it was. So I think also like when thinking about all the crises that happened then during Corona, so many young people were left behind in schools. People did not feel like politics really cared for them. So all the established parties, I think, were just a bit, they were kind of done with them because they did not see that they cared for them, which of course is not the case, but I can kind of understand why that caused this feeling a little bit. But of course that then especially the AfD was able to profit so much from that also shows that there's a lack of political education.
Yeah, I think also especially in Germany with the Greens, a lot of people were just disappointed by how many compromises they made in the government. And also at the same time that they did not focus enough on the social aspects. So
I agree. I think something that's truly really true is that the Greens are kind of losing their grip on the competency on climate politics. So I do think that's something they have to kind of find their way back into in the EU, and also Germany finding their position again in the political field, showing their stance on a lot of different issues, and especially how they interconnect with the climate issue.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that, and I think it was a really interesting discussion in the end now.
Yes, I agree.
And that's all for today's episode of the Green Horizon podcast, and thank you for joining us as we explored the intersections of climate policies and European politics.
Yes, and stay tuned for our next episode where we'll dive deeper into specific climate initiatives and their impact across Europe. Until next time!
Until next time!